Hello, everybody with the Mama Get Your Life Back group. And anybody else who would be joining us just for this special session, we have Kimberly Amici, who is a family culture coach. And you might be like, what does that even mean? What is family culture? Kimberly is going to share with us a little bit about her story, how she really began to navigate what family culture is and how she coaches other families to really go from letting our families just happen because everything gets really busy for all of us, and beginning to be really intentional with shaping our family's culture. So Kimberly, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now tell me what I've missed in the intro. Tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Okay. So family culture coach, a lot of people are like, what does that mean? So I first like to tell people, well, basically I'm a life coach. So I work with people one-on-one. I'm a cheerleader and encourager. I ask lots of questions. I help you overcome obstacles and get from where you are to where you want to be. And I have just sort of expanded, or should I say narrowed down my niche, and what I like to talk about is family. So essentially what I do is I help you imagine, plan, and build your best family. And one of the reasons that I fell in love with culture is because there was a point in time where I was working full time. I was working in, a corporate New York City environment. I was working for a design and architectural firm, and I understood what company culture was. And then I went to a church that had a really strong brand and a really strong culture, and I understood what culture was. And on my own personal journey, when I was trying to close the gap between what I wanted my family to look like and what was actually happening in my real life, I discovered culture and this idea of, the things, the principles that organizations and ministries apply and businesses apply in their organizations that makes them successful is what we can use to make families successful. So basically, I take the same principles that a business or an organization does to create culture, and we apply them to family. And so there's all these different components of culture, which I can talk a little bit about more in a minute. And we just apply them. I mean, these principles work. So why aren't we applying them at home? And I just started to see a change in my family when I started to grasp this idea of a mission statement and doing life on purpose and being intentional. And part of my journey is working with a life coach, seeing big changes in my life when I started to work, towards my values, determine what they were, start to live according to my values. I started to see all of these changes in my own life and then trickle down to my family. And I just became really passionate about helping families do that.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, having listened to your podcast, my husband and I were honored to be guests on your podcast, and just hearing your content. I love that really what you were sharing is going from what we want, like we have this idea of what we want our family to look like, but also what is actually happening and kind of where, like filling in the gap there. I love that you help take people on that journey from, okay, this is where we're at, this is where we want to be, and never we don't necessarily arrive to the and we're perfect. No one ever fights anymore. No. And that is between
I can't guarantee that. That is not a part of my money back guarantee.
There you go. But I just love that really it is that place of intention. And I don't even know if I knew you had started off with architecture. And I love that you went from really the architecture of buildings to now the architecture of family.
Yes.
So that's so beautiful. Where do you want to start? Do you want to tell us a little more about your story or?
Yeah, for sure. So my husband and I got married, and even let's back up a little bit. Before we got married, we took the classes, right? We did the workbooks. We, wrote out the list of things that, we wanted for our life. We talked about who was going to do what and who was going to take responsibility. Did I want to stay home? Did I not want to stay home? Did I want to work? What did we want to do? Where do we want to live? You have all these discussions, and it's fantastic. And I would say for the first couple of years we were married, we definitely were for lack of a better expression, living our best life. Like it was just the two of us. We got to do what we wanted, when we wanted. We felt empowered. And then we had children. And oops, let me my phone.
No worries.
And then we had children, and then it became extremely difficult, not because children are a bad thing. I don't want to paint that picture, but because all of a sudden life changed without us even knowing it. We became really busy. We had to incorporate things into our life that we had never anticipated. And our life was great and full, but we were overscheduled as the kids got older, and we started to put them in activities, and we moved to the suburbs, and we were signing up for all the things and doing what all the families were doing. We were really becoming overscheduled, disconnected, and burnt out from being busy. And we were doing a lot of good things. I mean, we were active in our church, and I was volunteering at school, and my kids were doing a sport and an instrument and a this and a that. But we weren't entirely happy. We realized that we were just going through the flow, and we found ourselves saying, hey, let's just get through this week. Let's just get through this month. Let's just get through this year. Like when our kids get to be X, Y, and Z, then we'll take that trip, or then we'll buy that house, or then we'll, whatever it was. We were just always filling in the blanks with like the future, but there was no plan in place. And even for me as a stay-at-home mom, I was saying yes to everything, right? Like, because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. I was making a lot of arbitrary decisions about what our life was going to be like. And we weren't holding it up to any sort of standard or looking at it through any lens. We were just like, like I said, going with the flow, right? And that's when I decided that I wanted to put together a family mission statement. And I started to do the research about like what it means to put together a family mission statement. And we sort of pulled one together that we were, kind of happy with. And we felt so good. We were like everybody else in Pinterest and in some of these like Christian circles. We were like, ooh, now we've arrived. And what we found that it made no difference in our life, because all it was a bunch of words that we had put on a wall, and we had hoped that that's what we would become. And as I dug deeper, I started to learn about culture. I started to learn about, what are your values? What are your practices around those values? Using those values to say yes to the things that matter and no to the things that don't. Putting things up, deciding whether or not to put things on your calendar, if they lined up with your values, and if they didn't, and you didn't put them on your calendar, you didn't sign up for that thing. Really getting intentional about what we wanted to see for our family, and really leaning into the things that we were naturally already becoming, and then even deciding what more we wanted to do or what different we wanted to do. And it was when we started to put a framework around those things that we started to see change. And that's where those principles come in from businesses and organizations. And they're onto something. And I discovered that if we applied those things to family, that we could shift, what our family looked like and how we did life. And so when we talk about culture, I find that people know exactly what it means in terms of businesses and organizations. So if I were to say Amazon, which we've already been talking about Amazon, you know what you're going to get when you deal with Amazon. If you say Zappos, you know exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get great customer service. That means like they have a culture where people love working there. Like Costco or one of those, big membership stores, you know what you're going to get. You're going to get a great value. You're going to get stuff that you're not going to get in your average store. You're going to get more than you need. Like we know these traits that are associated with the brands we love. And then when we start to look at families that way, I mean, I bet you could tell me about the culture of your neighbor. I bet you could tell me like what's going on in their home and what you can count on if you stop by. I bet you like what neighbor, if you knock on their door without calling first, who's going to let you in. I mean, maybe not over the last year and a half, but but who's going to let you in. Who's going to say help yourself. Who's going to rush you out because they never have time to see people. And my kids were able to recognize culture. They were able to identify their neighbors that always had the best snacks. They were able to tell me which neighbors whose kids always fought and they never really felt comfortable when they went over there. Like those are the things that families develop most of the time without even knowing. And it's what they're known for. It's how we recognize them, and it determines how we interact with them. And so if we spend the time to think about what does culture look like our family, we could really live into our potential, do what God's called us to do, but also be, have a life of joy and a life of peace and purpose.
Okay. You couldn't tell on my face, but internally I was cheering the whole time, because so much of what you said, Kimberly, was so bang on. I think that's why this is your niche and your lane, this thing that you have walked through personally, but also spend time in. And I think it's so relatable, just the idea that, whether moms or families or not, we can become people who just kind of say yes because we're like,
Mhm.
I guess I should say yes to this opportunity and this thing and this. But what you really have said here is once we identify what our values are, it is
Mhm.
really is a tool that we use, and we say, like, this framework, this is why we're going to say yes to this, even if it's hard, right?
Mhm.
Even if it's
Mhm.
inconvenient. This is why we're going to say no to this, even if it's shiny and seems great. And so it helps us really become people who say yes and no intentionally. And that's how we start to form who our family is. And I know for myself, I had taken a mentorship course years ago where a woman taught me about values for the first time. And it was mind blowing because I was like, oh, that's why sometimes I will feel a little bit off if I am making the wrong choice based on
Mhm.
my values. So even this past weekend, it was Saturday, and my husband was taking my two youngest girls. They're on a sports team together, and they had a game, and they're going to have a lot of games in the new year. But I was feeling this stress of like, there's a lot of stuff I got to get done today. Like this is, and you know what would be great? It'd be great to get stuff done with them not in the house. I was like, I'm going to do this. And so my husband took them about 20 minutes away where they're going to play this. And, and it was, I could just tell there was this thing inside me that was like, you know what? It really doesn't matter how many things, you're going to get your house clean today. You're going to do whatever.
Mhm.
Something is off here because I have that value of
Mhm.
family and that value of kind of showing up for them. And so I said to my other daughter, I was like, we were in our pajamas. I'm like, get dressed. We're hopping in the car.
Yeah.
And I knew, again, I was able to make that decision because the decisions we make, sometimes we get to process and talk about them for a while, but sometimes they are those split second. And I was like, this is the thing that I'm making because it's in line with my values. It doesn't actually
Mhm.
it's not the wisest decision on paper, but it is the thing so I think that's part of it, is knowing really who we are, even as women. Who are we? What are the things that are, and that's going to be different than your
Mhm.
spouse. So being able, the things that we're going to do with Kimberly, being able to identify for yourself, sit down, have your spouse go through those as well. And then coming together and saying like, okay, now as a family, like what are the things in our family? It helps us understand even some of those ways we can kind of butt heads, or also like you were saying, um, we know what the neighbor is all about. And we can see that even on social media. Well, we know what that
Mhm.
family on social media is all about. Should we be like, we should probably do more of, XYZ? It helps eliminate some of that comparison.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So,
mean,
yeah.
you've touched on a lot of things. I mean, you've touched on this idea of it helps you with comparison 100%. When we are following our values, we stop comparing ourselves to other people. We have confidence that we're in our lane. Decision making, that was huge for me. Like I had such decision fatigue. Like I wanted to always make the right choice, and I never knew what the right choice was. And it was really arbitrary. But this idea of determining your values and deciding what those practices are, and even use like the language that we choose to use in our home, you're making decisions ahead of time. You're actually alleviating the need to go through a pros and cons list or to like agonize over every decision that you make for your family, because you've already made the decisions about what's important to you. And that is like, it's so incredible to not have that stress. I mean, that doesn't mean that you never have to really examine certain decisions that you make, but it just makes it so much easier. You don't have to be expending that emotion and that time and that energy in places that you don't need to. And it actually like saves your family time.
Yeah.
One of the things it also does, understanding family culture and what you are as a family, is it creates that sense of belonging with your kids. You know, you can tell your children that they matter, but if they don't feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves, there's going to be a disconnect. And knowing that, watching my children as they've gotten older be able to make decisions without me in the room, because they know what our family stands for and they know what our family's values are, is just, it just makes me so happy.
So cool.
You know, they know that this is going to be a yes from mom. And they also know it's going to be a no, it's going to be a no from mom. And it just frees them up. It gives them that sense of belonging, but it frees them up and empowers them to make decisions as well. And just the excitement that is created around, you know, belonging and showing up for things and having something that centers you is just, is that energy is contagious.
So good. Well, let's dive into some of the how. So how we go from, I mean, even how do we start with figuring out, you know, what our
Yeah.
values are and what we want our family to look like. So where would
Yeah.
we start?
Okay, so one of the first things that I do, so I do have a resource that helps people walk through this process, but one of the first things I like to do is examine your past. Your past is really important because many of us probably are doing things that we just have, that's just the way we've always done it. It's the way it was done in our home. Anytime you do like any kind of marriage counseling, I do believe they make you look at this because we bring in certain expectations into our home based on what our mother did, what our dad did, and what was expected of us. And if we're not careful in a marriage, we can start living according to different expectations and getting frustrated that we don't understand why the other person
100%.
doesn't do it this way, right? So this idea of looking at our past, looking at the expectations that we've created that we may not even notice. So what did you do? You know, where did you spend most of your time as a child? Was it at home? Was it at friend's house? Why? Like, where were you? And what are the things that you love doing? So I remember there's things about my home that was really, really important to me growing up. And I've duplicated that for my children. But when you're in a relationship and you're you're parenting with someone else, it's important to figure out what said, you know, what were some of their memories? What was their home life look like? So that you can start to sort of figure out what's important and, you know, bring those together and create something new.
So good. Well, I love that because I think there is a bit of an underlying expectation sometimes that is just a vision that we have in our head. Like, especially we're recording this before Christmas, we have a like, this is what the holidays look like for me. This is what, and people can end up really bumping heads because we haven't yet said like, well, this is how I experienced it. But we also want to figure out, what do we want that experience to be? What do we want that, which can bring up the need for a lot of conversations, both with your spouse and maybe a lot of extended family.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would be a question. And
Mhm.
and also all of these questions people can get where?
So I will give you a link, but you can also find them on my website right away. When you go to buildyourbestfamily.com or kimberlyamici.com, you'll find them there, but I can also provide you a link that you can share with everybody that's been on this call and with the replay.
Awesome. Okay, so where would we go from there?
So we want to identify, okay, so number one, we want to identify where we spent most of our time as a child and why we spent it there, probably because we like something about it, right? And number two is, what are some of your favorite memories and traditions growing up? You know, traditions, those are such fun things. Those are definitely one of those things that creates a sense of belonging. When it comes to traditions and when it comes to determining what we want to do for our family, it's really important to think of the why behind them. You know, why am I doing this tradition? Again, is it because we did it growing up? Is it because I want to instill a value into my children and this helps us do that? Yeah, just recognizing our past and some of those memories and what they created in us and how we think back over those times.
Love that. Okay.
And number three, what are some of those experiences that you would like to pass on to your family? again, just more of this examining of your past. I can remember, especially during the holidays are the easiest to think of, but I can remember, we used to go to my godparents' house every Christmas Eve. And I can remember their home had this beautiful star during Christmas time up like on the top tippy top of their house. And where they lived, it's tons of farmland. It's kind of on a hill, like it's kind of a house on a hill. It's not surrounded by much, but a couple barns and some farmland. And I just can remember every year driving along that main road as we came down the street and seeing the house and knowing that we were going and we were spending time with those family members. And we have a star in our house now. Like, you know what I mean? It's not necessarily like, it means something to me, right? So when we start to form our family's culture, like what are these things that we experience, whether an experience or something that's symbolic or something that just sticks out on our mind, like what would we like to duplicate? Like that to me, like you could have all the Christmas lights in the world, but that star meant to me Jesus. You know what I mean? That was like, for me, that was a symbol that transcended all the commercialism of the holiday. And even when I was young, I didn't know how to put it to words like that, but that meant the world to me. And so it just, seeing that star reminds me, like the one that's outside our house now, it reminds me of family, it reminds me of gathering, it reminds me of Jesus. And so what are those things that I experienced that I want to pass on to my family?
Well, as you were saying that, I was thinking, outside of the holidays, growing up, if we were at home, we ate at the dinner table. So sometimes we were not at home because we were one of those like on the go sports to sports families and all the things. But I have so many memories sitting at the table, having like the food was on the table, we served there. And sometimes it was like, I'm throwing something at my brother because we've got in a fight, or milk is coming out my nose because I've laughed so hard. But really that was such a great place for us to connect. And I think that's something that I have felt like I really want to, as much as I can, preserve us sitting at the table. So we have those. I like that you mentioned kind of the why behind not just copying the same thing, but why do we want to have some of those things? And then keep going with what's next.
Yeah. This is a really good one. What were you missing as a child or as a young adult? And can you provide that for others? I did not have like the cool house to hang out at. So that's what I wanted for my kids. As a mom of teens, it's harder to be cool than you think. I'm trying my best, but that was something that I didn't have growing up that I wanted to pass along. So whether we're identifying things that were amazing or identifying things, and they didn't have to be terrible, but just things that we didn't have that we want to provide for our kids or for others, what might those things be?
Yeah. And I think that is quite natural. You will see people talk about, we do this as a family because I didn't have that while we were growing up. And I think I have seen it go to the extreme where it's the, like we didn't have gifts under the tree. Now we have, so many things, whatever. And I think for my mom, it was a bit of I never got to be part of any extracurriculars. So then we were like, wow, we, did so much. But I think just even, again, similar to your question before, why? Like not just doing it, and this is never anything you're saying, but not just doing the things because, but really getting down to that. Well, why do you want it to be a fun place or a safe space? Or like, what are the things that I think kind of digging deeper, because then even the expression of it will look different in different ways. So whatever the thing might be, I think that for me is one of my favorite questions. And even I was chatting with somebody recently who is in her early to mid 40s, and again was talking a little bit about the things that she was missing out on in her relationship with her parents. And I think it's hard because inevitably we're not going to be perfect moms, right? Like that's not
Yes.
any part of what this group is, but paying attention to, who are our kids uniquely created to be, and what are the things they really want from us. And it was interesting because even this woman I was talking to, it was relationship. It was, I just wanted that person to say, I'm proud of you, or I'm right. Like some of those things that don't, and I love that you bring your kids into this as well. And that's a powerful thing. When you shared with me the first time you shared sitting down with your kids and really asking them, I don't know exactly the words you use, but it was like, what do you want to see differently in our family? Like what can mom and dad do differently? And we sat down. That's one of the scariest things you can do with your kids.
Yeah. I can share a couple of those questions too. Yeah.
Because it's, they will be honest, but it's so good. Because it's like, oh, you hit the nail on the head there. Like, you know what, that is, and going back and like being able to share that is such a incredible way to build connection and have a real conversation as a family when you are asking some of those like vulnerable, put me on the spot questions. So why don't you dive into some of those questions with our kids?
Yeah. Well, I do want to back up for just a bit.
Sure.
One of the things you talked about, this idea of doing things because you go to the extreme, right? Yeah. So I realized very early in my motherhood that I was holding myself up to an expectation that I was really never meant to meet. When I was growing up, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And even though she worked, she was definitely working like later hours. And my dad didn't have to be at work real early. So I would go to school. I would often get up, feed myself breakfast, and go to school. And when I was in college, I went home with a college boyfriend to Canada, to Ontario. Yeah. And his mom was up way before we were, and she had breakfast made, and she was folding the laundry and made me a cup of tea. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is the kind of mom I want to be. Like I kind of like swung and said, oh my gosh, my parents didn't do this for me, but I want to be that. And I spent a great part of my, when my kids were young, trying to be that mom and putting unrealistic expectations on myself. And so that was really something I had to have a heart change about. Again, it's not just, like, why do I want to be that mom? And have I set up a standard, and am I carrying this into my motherhood? And I don't really need to. And then that was part of my own personal journey of trying to determine, well, what kind of mom do I want to be? What's important to me? How do I want to show up? And then what do I have to do to show up that way? And again, that's this whole idea of creating culture, deciding ahead of time about what's important to you and what matters to you, and not just living into a knee-jerk reaction that we've had because of something we've experienced, whether we want to embrace it or whether we want to reject it. Like, what is it that we want to do on purpose?
So good.
Yeah.
Sorry, somebody just called me and it bumped my screen, and I hope it didn't. Oh,
you're still there. I see you.
Okay.
Well, I can share one more question before we jump to the kids too.
I'm here, and I'm just wanted to make sure we're still recording. Okay. We're still good.
Okay. So one other question we can ask ourselves, and this is sort of a fun question, is what sights, sounds, and smells say home? Now, I have to tell you, this might be something that you might not have the answers to right away. Like, for example, like I have wind chimes. My aunt gave them to me when I was young. And you don't notice something like that until there's the absence of it. Mm-hmm. And then you will go somewhere and you'll hear them and you're like, oh my gosh, that reminds me of home. Or you like walk into a restaurant or a bakery, or there's a certain type of smell. Like I know I can smell something and it smells like my grandmother. Or I inherited my grandmother's clock and it has this beautiful chime. Like just hearing that makes me feel safe. I think of even the birds, right? The morning doves that make that cooing sound in the evenings. When I hear that, that just reminds me of family get-togethers and things that we would do over the summer. And so these are just as important as some of the other things that we want to create for our home, because it creates an atmosphere. And I'm not able to necessarily duplicate everything I experience, but this idea of like, maybe dimming the lights and lighting candles, and do you have music playing in the background in the evenings, or do you wake up to certain things? And so what are those rhythms? What are those things that set home to you? And if you like them, you can keep them. And if not, what do you want to create in your home? So for example, one of the things we do is I have music playing from 7:30 to 8:30. I did it a couple of years ago, and now I don't even remember it. It's on an alarm. We have Sonos. So every day at 7:30, the worship music comes on, because I knew that I went through a season where that was really important to have in the background of my life. And I just wanted to have it on. I didn't want to forget about it. And so now it's sort of our soundtrack in the morning. Love it. And when we don't have that music, I'm like, it's awfully quiet in here, So,
Yeah.
So these sounds and these sights and these smells, we can actually use those on purpose to create an atmosphere that we want in our home, and create rhythms in our life. So that's just a fun question that I think still builds.
Well, yeah. I actually think, it does seem like a fun question, like, oh, what's the big deal of it, smell or whatever, but you will have smells that you're like, oh no, that's my grandma's house, or that, you smell something. And even the sounds, we had very few, my parents were not really into music, but we had a few we had a few records and tapes. We always had like Amy Grant Christmas, and some of those songs are still my favorite. And I love that you used the word atmosphere, because I think all those things are really these atmosphere builders. And I will notice sometimes for myself, again, I can get in that mode of, I want to get a lot of things done, or, whatever I'm doing with the kids, kind of that, like I can still be I'm trying to get through this. Like, I just got to make dinner. I just got to do that, right? All those things. And there's a song that I've been playing called Ordinary Day. I will try to link it in our content community, and because I can't remember who it's by, but I will play that song. And that song reminds me, this is like, be present in this ordinary day with your family. And so sometimes it'll play like 3 or 4 times, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, we're not in a rush to go anywhere. I don't need to get through this thing. I can be present and look you in the eye. And so I just like that, those things. And even the way you said it, just kind of, you had it almost kind of automated, where you would have things happening. I think we can sometimes decide, this is what we want it to look like. How do I make it easy for myself? So does it look like I make a morning playlist or a bedtime playlist? Does it look like I have candles already on the table, or intentionally I'm going to keep that table clutter free so we can sit together? Like, what do we need to do to set ourselves up to create that atmosphere? So I love that.
Yeah. And so I'm going to group these next 2 questions, because I want to make sure we have time for everything. When we go to other people's homes, what makes us feel welcomed? And then you can take 3 families that you know, and what immediately comes to mind when you think of them. And I asked this question not to, so we can copy other families, but so that we can realize the impact of a family's culture.
Yeah.
So I could take any given of my friends, and I could sit there and I could try to think of 3 things, and you can think of them, and it starts to form what you might want to be known for. So when we took this conversation to our kids, those are the questions that we asked them, because we knew they were young enough to understand that. Yeah. And so as we began to ask them the questions, what is so-and-so known for, and what is so-and-so known for, we were able to follow up with a question. And this is on I believe it's on the sheet with the kids. Let's see, any favorite things to do. Yeah. So like, what do you want your friends to say about you? If someone were to sit at a table and say, hey, the Amici family, what do you want people to come? What do you want to come to their mind? And it really made them think, especially after they were able to identify, what families were known for what. And they had some really good ideas. They said, we don't want to be known for bickering and fighting. And that was like a huge win. I didn't have to convince them. Yeah. I didn't have to convince them that that's not what they should be doing. they were able to identify that there was a certain family that's all they ever did. And it was so annoying, Mom, when we go over their house and they never get in trouble for fighting and their mom doesn't make them stop. And like, it was a win. They understood. And when it came time to say, well, do you want people to think that when they come over to our house? And they're like, no way, and, of course they said fun things like, well, we like playing games. People know us for playing games, or, they wanted me to have more snacks like Mrs. Maria across the street, and that's a valid thing. I mean, I have teenagers now and they know, the first thing they do when the soccer carpool shows up is they go straight for the pantry, and I've even gotten into the habit of saying, hey, is there anything you guys like in particular? I'll make sure I get them next time. And they're like, oh my God, but again, like if I think about my past, my one friend, I used to love going to her house because I was allowed to eat whatever I wanted. And I wasn't allowed to do that at my house.
Awesome.
My mom didn't have the cool snacks. Yeah. So what is it that we want to lean into, we want to do on purpose?
Well, I love that you shared that. And it's funny because I think also there is the vision. So that's part of what we're talking about. We're going to write it down. We're going to like create the vision. And then there's also the reality. And so even just this last example of, I'm like, I want my home to be a place where the kids are going to come hang out. So right now my kids are still young where it's like a play date, but later it's going to be teenagers. And so there was one moment in the summer where there was 3, I think everybody had a play date. And then my one daughter had a few friends and it was like, can we all do that? And I was like, yeah. And because I have such strong, like introverted tendencies, I was like, part of me wanted to be like, can you guys just go play somewhere else? Can you guys go to the bed? Like, I really wanted to be like, no, I'm tired. And I really had to say to myself, like, this is what you want. And this is what it looks like. So it actually, the playing out of what we want our family to be all about and the vision, it probably will be a little bit more uncomfortable and awkward and have just the reality of it playing out. And so even the snacks thing, I had one friend who was like, you know what, I'm working this extra shift or doing this extra thing because I want my freezer packed with frozen pizzas and whatever it is for when these hungry teenagers come over, so that I'm not stressed about what am I going to feed them and how. She was like, this is what I'm doing, kind of following through with the vision. And so I love that what you have in all of these questions is really us unpacking it. And then we get to live it out and kind of like, how do people remind themselves? How do they begin that process of like living out what they are beginning to kind of unpack about what they want?
Yeah. Well, so the first and most important thing is naming it. So when I work with people or when they go through my course, we typically talk about like what our values are. So those are 5 value words. Like, for example, ours is creativity, excellence. I'm looking at my list, generosity, faith, and integrity. Right. And we have practices. We've decided what those words look like. Right. So we've done the work of saying, like, for example, integrity means we always tell the truth. We honor our commitments even when it's inconvenient, and we are authentic and consistent in how we treat one another, right? So those are the 3 things we can say when we know that we're walking in integrity when we're doing those things, right? But also those cultural practices, once we've named them, so whether it's a value or whether it's a cultural practice, once you've named it, you could actually like back yourself out of, and you're like, what is it that this looks like? And how do I know if I've achieved it? And so the work there's a little bit of, there's additional work that comes into play. So like you said, like if I want snacks in the house, that means I've got to budget part of our income for that extra food in the house. If we say that travel is important to us, like, okay, we're doing the calendar for the year. Are these trips on the calendar? Are we setting money aside? Are we, looking online to find out like, when, where should we go and where can we afford to go? I mean, it looks even as detailed as saying, okay, travel is important to us. So I want to do 1 big trip a year. I want to do a weekend trip quarterly and then a day trip, when the kids have off school. It's like really outlining, what does that really look like? So some of the exercises I take people through is, okay, in this category, when it comes to this value or this practice, what is, like, if you were to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, what does a 10 look like?
Mhm.
You know, what does a 10 look like in hospitality and having your home open? What does it look like to be living your best, whatever, creative life, or you know, life of creativity? What do those things look like? You say you love games. Well, have you had a game night in the last year? Like,
Yeah.
let's go to the calendar. Let's make sure we schedule a game night once a month. Do we want to bring friends into that? Okay, so once a month, we choose a new friend to invite over and ask them to join us in it. Like, you know, when you're planning a party, do we have a game? Like we can really break it down into practical steps. And so it's imagining what this value is, or what this practice is, or what we want to be known for, and then saying, like, what would that look like in our life if we can maybe wave a magic wand, if it could be a 10? And you're not going to achieve it perfectly, that's not the idea, but thinking practically about what it is to fulfill something is just as important as saying, hey, we want to be known for this.
Yeah.
And then oh yeah, I forgot. Go ahead. I had a thought.
Well, I was just thinking about how good that is in terms of so much of what we want to do is have vision and
Mhm,
then the practical living out. And I think sometimes, even like taking your example of the holiday, I think it's
mhm,
easy for us to say things like, "Ah, well, that's impossible," or it's hard, like, or even the like a freezer full of snack, like those things that can feel big. But once we have a vision for it and saying, no, this is what I want to do, we will actually start to work on creative ways to solve those problems and make
mhm,
those things happen. And part of it will look like, hey, we are going to put on our calendar, like let's say the games night thing. So for
mhm,
our family, we have chosen, actually this past year, we had a family word of the year, and we
mhm.
actually just told our kids what it was. We were like, our word of the year is stewardship, and we are going to learn how to take care of all the things. So whether it's bringing stuff in from the van, like the garbage pieces, or taking care of some of your stuff that we haven't, look, you really have to, a word like that, you have to learn how to live out.
Mhm,
So the other night we were talking about what our word of the year could be. So we sat down as a family, and my kids had some ridiculous suggestions because they're young and they still don't really understand the concept. One of them was like reading quietly, and I'm like, probably not the word of the year. But my husband said hospitality, and I
mhm,
thought, that becomes again another filter for us to say, if we want to be a family who is known for hospitality, it's going to look like pulling out our calendar, putting something on the calendar, and then getting the food ready, like all of the things that come into play with that.
mhm,
Being intentional to go after it, because I think what you shared at the beginning was just that we can often end up in this place of, oh, I wish we could do that thing. Oh, I wish, and we kind of end up in the like, and we can't do everything.
mhm,
Be very clear about the things that we value, and the things that you value are going to be different than the things that we value. And the expression of that is going to be a little bit different
mhm,
as well.
mhm.
Um, so,
And it looks different in different seasons too,
well, that's good.
for sure. I mean, like real quickly, the pain when the obviously when that for those first couple of weeks of lockdown, we were like, oh my gosh, like what are we going to do? And then a couple of weeks in, we're like, well, how do we live out our values in a really different way? And for us, like games was super duper important to us. Of course, we started playing games all the time because there wasn't much else to do with one another. But then we ended up doing a Minute to Win It. Have you ever heard of that
Yeah,
old game show, Minute to Win It?
yeah.
We picked like I think like 8 families, and we dropped off goodie bags at their house, and we did a virtual Minute to Win It where we had everybody on the screen like competing against one another. And I set up this YouTube videos, and I had that play. It was so much fun. We did Taboo one night. We like dropped off a half a deck of the cards at their house so that they could play it, and we could play it across the screen. We did another trivia night with this one group we have where we all downloaded the what is that, party room or party, I don't even remember the app.
Yeah.
We could all like see each other and play trivia games. And so we found other ways, even in the midst of that, to do games and do hospitality. We even dropped a goodie bag off at like a different group of friends' house that had a deck of cards. We printed out our 3 favorite games that we like to play together, and we put some popcorn in there, and then some, questions to ask your family members, sort of thing, like a little goodie bag. Like, we were still trying to think of how to live our values out, even in the midst of all of the restrictions. And so even when the seasons change and when we can't live out our values, and we feel like, oh my gosh, because these values are a part of who we choose to be as a family. And for us, we didn't want those to all just go away because we couldn't actually physically do them in the way that we wanted to do them in the past. And so whether it's money that changes your situation or a pandemic, you can still live out your values. And sometimes you just have to change the way you live them out.
So good. Well, one of the things I'm going to do in the Mama Get Your Life Back content library is I will share the link to the podcast episode where you were on Ready to Thrive, and where we talked about your family retreats, because we don't have time to talk about it here. That is another thing I've really appreciated about the intentionality you've had in getting away with your family to, again, just kind of like you would with a company, where it's like, let's evaluate, let's have every person on the team have a say. And I think that would be the last thing I'd want us to kind of end on, is how do we include everybody? Like I said, last year we told the kids, this is our word of the year. This year, what does it look like to have them own it, engage in that? And so are there any other ways we can just get our kids on board with creating this culture?
I think that just asking them questions, asking for the feedback. One of the questions we do ask in our family retreat is, what do you like most about our family? And what do you like least about our family? I mean, those 2 questions alone can really help you shape who you guys decide to become. I mean, when our kids answered what they don't like about us, we were like, and they all said the same answer. And we were like, okay, that needs to change. They didn't even collaborate on the answer. And so asking them questions. And then as you begin to develop your family culture, the language that you use around yourself, around your family, like we're Team Amici. And when something happens that I don't think lines up with our values, I'm like, hey, the Amicis don't do that. Like, it's a kind of a joke now, like the Amicis do this. And just continuing to speak life and purpose, and remind them, constantly pointing them back to it, and then they get to a point where they're like, yeah, that's what we do. That's what we do. They will begin to pick up that language. They'll begin to see the fruit of what you're saying and the intention in your life. And just, that's a big, that really helps the kids get on board and start to, rehearse and identify those things.
Now, what would you say if someone is watching, because there is certain ages where it is easier to help shape culture. And then there also are just sometimes personalities of our kids that are also going to be more of a pushback. What would you say? Because I know you have experience coaching families and different ages, stages, personalities. What about the kids who are like just not on board? Like, they're like, I'm not into it. Like, I was the teenager who my parents had family meetings, and I was like, oh, I do not want to go to a family meeting. And they asked the question, they joke about this now. They're like, what do you want to change about our family? And I just said the name of my younger brother. I was like, Jared, that's what needs to go. So what thoughts would you have for somebody who's feeling like, I'm not getting buy-in from my kids, from my teenagers?
Yeah. So I think the feedback's certainly important. And that allows them to be like, wow, my opinion matters. I mean, again, like some of these things, as we know with children, we may not see the fruit of certain things until later. And so I just encourage mamas to sow seeds, right? Like, for example, our kids, they know we go to church, and like post-pandemic church attendance has been tough. Like, my kids are like, wait, why are we going to church? I'm like, because they're meeting again. Like, they'd gotten out of the habit, but now we're just lovingly reinforcing the fact that that's what we do. Church is open today, so we're going to go. Like, that's just how it works. Getting kids to buy in and getting their opinion on some of the minutia about what's going on. I've let my kids help me figure out our chore system. Like, how do you want to group the chores? How do you want to rotate them? You guys do it. You want you to handle this. I've empowered them in our family meeting by letting them each take a role, like who prays over the meeting, who runs the calendar, who closes the meeting. Like, giving them roles is another way of giving them ownership. When we started doing, like when everything got shut down and we started having all of these family nights, like we literally had one pick the food we were going to eat. We had one of them pick the music. And I'll have to say, I got introduced to a lot of music I had never heard before. And but they all of a sudden were like, oh, this is about us. Like, all of a sudden allowing them to be making the decisions. I mean, I do believe that the children are not the one to set the tone for the home. They're not setting the values for the home, but they do have a say in some of the cultural things that happen. So when we go on vacation, every child, we make sure our itinerary includes something that every child wants to do. Like, for us, it's bringing them into the decision-making process. It's giving them ownership. I mean, it's not necessarily going to stop maybe the pushback in an instant, but over time, if they feel like their opinion matters, they're a part of something bigger than themselves, and something that when you're giving them something that they can take ownership of, they will slowly start to be like, oh, like we're onto something here. Yeah. And the kids don't have to be the same to have cohesiveness and unity. So you know what I mean? To be in a culture.
Yeah. I do really appreciate that. I feel like, there are seasons and situations where it's just harder. And being a high school teacher, I am seeing kids right now that are in hard places. So I feel like it is one of those things too, where I'm kind of going back to what you said about the atmosphere. Like, we can't control everything that's happening out there, certainly. And we can't even control everything that's happening for our kids, like in here, but we get to, that saying where it's like, you be the thermostat. I think there's like one right behind me.
Yeah.
Thermostat, not the thermometer. So I think that's part of what really this group is for, is that we get to create, like, we can set the tone, we can set the atmosphere, we can take care of what's in here with us and get on our knees a ton. And then really be kind of just saying, okay, we're going to be steady we're going to be like setting this tone and this culture, even though there's going to be kind of some of those waves and some of those other things that are coming and going. Because probably even looking back, I can think back to, some of the experiences that I put my own parents through. And yet they kind of stayed steady. Right? Like this was who they were. This was our home, this safe place, all these things. And so regardless of my own antics or other things, it was like, okay, we're steady here. So I hope that's encouraging to people who are watching. We are going to wrap up, but I want to hear, how can people hear more about you and all of the things that you do, and even some of your coaching, if people are like, okay, I really this is what I need to dive into a little bit deeper. Tell me all the things.
Yeah. So I have the Build Your Best Family podcast. And on that podcast, I interview people that are building culture and are talking about the good things that we need to know for our family. But I also am doing segments where I'm talking with other moms about how we build culture in our home and some of the things that matter to us as we're raising kids. So that's the Build Your Best Family podcast. And you can find me at buildyourbestfamily.com. And in the upcoming new year, I currently do coaching. So I do coaching where you could either buy the Build Your Best Family online course where you can imagine, plan, and build your best family, or we can coach through it. I can walk you through, you can watch the modules, I can walk you through the homework. We can literally break apart any of the work that you're doing and wrestling with your values and helping you kind of direct you and hold you accountable and cheer you on. So I do that kind of coaching. In the new year, we'll be taking some groups through the course, and then eventually we'll be doing some smaller masterminds where we help moms to really flourish when it comes to their faith, family, and friendships.
Love it. Well, Kimberly, thank you so much for being here. I know that has really encouraged me even more so as we are right now, we're going to be entering a new year, and it's always a great time to be kind of stepping back and saying, hey, where are we at and where do we want to go? So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome.